It was a sweltering Texas afternoon in the summer of 1943 when a train screeched to a halt near a newly built stockade ringed with barbed wire. On board, hundreds of weary German soldiers, veterans of North Africa and U-boat patrols, shifted uncomfortably on the hard benches. They were prisoners of war, captured thousands of miles from the deserts of Tunisia and the dark Atlantic they'd once hunted. They had prepared themselves for humiliation, hunger, maybe even brutality. Instead, as the guards opened the rail cars, something unexpected happened. American MPs didn't scream or threaten. They formed neat lines, checked names against prisoner lists, and to the shock of the Germans, offered canteens of cold water. "Step down slowly," one GI said in halting German. "Keep your hands where we can see them." The captives blinked in the fierce Texas sun, expecting snarling dogs or swinging rifle butts. Instead, they saw orderly rows of tents and wooden buildings inside the wire, clean, spacious, and astonishingly well built. But there weren't enough barracks yet. The camp had been built for a few hundred prisoners, not the thousands pouring in after the fall of the Afrika Korps. That was when the second surprise came. A sergeant motioned for a translator. "We have lumber and nails," the American said. "If you want better housing, build it yourselves." The prisoners looked at one another in disbelief. These were men who'd been told Americans were brutal and vengeful. Yet here were their captors, handing them tools and trusting them to work, even to improve their own prison. In that moment, the reality of captivity in the United States cracked open a myth carried all the way from Berlin. The enemy they'd fought might be more generous and more practical than they'd ever imagined. This was not an isolated event. Over the next 3 years, across more than 500 camps, scattered from Maine's pine forests to the cotton fields of Texas and the wide plains of Nebraska, nearly 500,000 German POWs lived under a system unlike any in modern warfare. They would be fed well, paid for their labor, allowed to write home, and most astonishingly, given hammers, saws, and concrete to build their own quarters. This is the story of how an unexpected American approach to prisoners of war stunned hardened veterans, turned enemies into craftsmen, and quietly shaped the post-war world. America's POW challenge by 1942. The United States faced an unanticipated logistical nightmare. Its military was exploding in size, and with victories in North Africa and the Atlantic came prisoners, thousands, then tens of thousands. In November 1942, Operation Torch captured entire German regiments in Morocco and Algeria. By May 1943, after the surrender of the Afrika Korps at Tunis, the number of Axis POWs surged past 250,000. Britain, already straining to feed itself under U-boat attack, couldn't house them all. The solution: ship prisoners across the Atlantic to the United States, where space, food, and manpower were plentiful. Soon, Liberty ships and troop transports were carrying Germans westward, ironically sailing in the very convoys their own navy had once tried to destroy. But where to put them? The U.S. War Department rushed to create a nationwide system of prisoner-of-war camps. By war's end, more than 500 main camps and 500 branch work details dotted the country. Places like Camp Swift in Texas, Camp Claiborne in Louisiana, and Camp Atterbury in Indiana became temporary. German towns behind barbed wire, and here the story takes its first unexpected turn. Unlike the grim expectations of German soldiers, shaped by Nazi propaganda about American cruelty, the camps were built to follow the 1929 Geneva Convention. That treaty required humane treatment, adequate housing, decent food, medical care, and opportunities for work. The U.S., determined to model its moral high ground and encourage reciprocity for American POWs in Europe, took the rules seriously. But reality on the ground went beyond mere compliance. The War Department faced a practical issue. They could construct only so many barracks, and prisoner numbers were skyrocketing. Lumber was limited, construction crews were busy with war industry, and delays meant overcrowding. So officers made a pragmatic, and in hindsight, brilliant decision. Let the prisoners help that at many new camps. German POS were issued tools and materials under guard and told to expand their own facilities. They hammered, sawed, poured concrete, and built not just barracks, but mess halls, recreation centers, even theaters and chapels. The Americans supervised but didn't micromanage. For seasoned soldiers who expected only punishment, it was baffling. Former Afrika Korps infantryman Wolfgang Fuchs recalled stepping off the train in Texas. We had imagined fences and mud, beatings perhaps. Instead, the Americans handed us boards and said, "Build your house." It felt impossible and strangely respectful. At Camp Clinton in Mississippi, prisoners erected entire clusters of wooden barracks in weeks. At Camp Algona in Iowa, German carpenters turned surplus lumber into not just huts, but a functioning theater with a stage and curtains. In Nebraska's Camp Atlanta, POWs dug foundations and raised orderly rows of huts with whitewashed walls. The policy wasn't just humane, it was smart. Giving prisoners work reduced boredom and unrest. It created a sense of order, a rhythm to days otherwise empty of purpose, and it fit American practicality. Why not use skilled labor, sitting idle behind wire? Many of these men had been craftsmen, engineers, or builders before the war. First impressions: shock and disbelief. For men fresh from Rommel's army, the contrast was dizzying. Their last months had been chaos. Retreat across desert, hunger, strafing by Allied planes, the final encirclement in Tunisia. Now, after the long voyage in crowded holds, they stepped into quiet fields and forests. Instead of revenge, their captors offered saws and nails. Some prisoners whispered that it was a trick, perhaps sabotage, if they built poorly. But day after day, the Americans paid little mind beyond security. A few guards even joked with them, pointing out crooked rafters or lending a hand to lift beams. Letters home carefully censored, but still revealing. Show astonishment. One private wrote to his family in Saxony, "We build our own quarters here. They even allow us to design the rooms as we wish, though under watch. The guards treat us fairly." Another noted the abundance of food. Plenty to eat, even meat twice a week. Coffee in the mornings. This, from men who had gone hungry in the desert, 2 American guards, many themselves farm boys or tradesmen. It seemed obvious. Keep the prisoners busy, keep the peace. Sergeant Harold Myers of Kansas later recalled, "You give a man something to build, he stops thinking about running and starts arguing about how to fit the door straight." Something subtle happened inside those fences. By trusting POS with meaningful work, camp commanders created a microcosm where Germans organized themselves, assigning carpenters, planners, team leaders. In some places, senior NCOs effectively ran construction details. While Americans supplied materials and oversight. This autonomy chipped at Nazi ideology. Among the POS were die-hard party loyalists and ordinary draftees. In the early months, some Nazi hardliners tried to enforce discipline, but practical work diluted their control. Men busy hammering planks and digging post holes had little time for political lectures. At Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma, when a small Nazi faction tried to intimidate moderates, camp officials deliberately separated them, leaving the rest to build and manage daily life. Over time, pragmatic cooperation with guards eroded the myth of American barbarism and exposed young soldiers to a different social order, one where even enemies could work with a degree of dignity. Beyond barracks, schools, theaters, chapels, building housing was just the beginning. Once basic shelter was up, POWs used spare lumber and scrap to create surprising amenities. At Camp Algona, German artisans built a 40-foot-high Christmas nativity scene with life-sized carved figures, admired even by local townsfolk. Some camps boasted libraries, stocked with German classics and technical manuals. Prisoners ran classes in languages, math, and trades. Officers taught engineering and agriculture. Chaplains, sometimes German, sometimes American, helped set up worship spaces. Music thrived. Prisoners built makeshift instruments or received them from Red Cross parcels. Choirs and orchestras performed, not just for inmates, but occasionally for curious locals invited to listen. This cultural life grew directly from the first decision to let prisoners build. Once men realized they could shape their environment, creativity followed. For many, it was the first taste of agency since surrender. Meals surprised nearly everyone. American supply lines were vast. The same Liberty ships that carried them across the ocean also delivered rations. Geneva Convention rules required caloric parity with U.S. troops. So German POWs ate almost as well as the guards. White bread, meat, potatoes, coffee, sometimes even fresh eggs and fruit when local farmers sold surplus. Compared to rations on the front or in Europe, often thin soup and black bread, it felt abundant. I could not believe the breakfast, recalled one former Afrika Korps corporal at Camp Swift. Coffee, real butter, jam. After Africa, we were half starved. Here we became strong again. Some joked they would be sent back to Germany fat. American pragmatism showed again. Well-fed prisoners were easier to manage and less likely to riot or escape. In fact, escape was rare. The distances were vast, the language unfamiliar, and local law enforcement cooperative. Most men decided life inside camp was safer than wandering Texas or Nebraska alone. Friendly contact began at small points. American guards and prisoners traded cigarettes for simple carpentry favors. Translators emerged, men who'd learned English in school or at sea. Curious G is sometimes asked about Germany, and prisoners, cautious at first, opened up. Soon, the War Department realized another opportunity. With millions of Americans overseas, the U.S. faced critical labor shortages, especially in agriculture. Under Geneva rules, non-officer POWs could work if paid a fair wage credited to their accounts. The Americans organized work detachments, small guarded groups sent to harvest crops, cut timber, or do construction. This was revolutionary to men used to rigid control. Imagine stepping off a camp truck in Kansas wheat country, barbed wire far behind, and being handed farm tools instead of rifles. Farmers welcomed the help. Crops needed bringing in, and local young men were at war. Prisoners earned script tokens redeemable for small comforts: toothpaste, soap, extra food, even musical instruments. One Nebraska farmer remembered, they were just boys. Worked hard, glad for fresh air. Some taught us German songs. Many POS wrote home that they'd seen kindness unimaginable from an enemy farm wives sending them lemonade. Kids watching wide-eyed. At first, the U.S. military was nervous about letting enemy soldiers roam under light guard, but incidents were rare. By 1944, over 90% of able-bodied German POS were working daily outside the fences, building roads, cutting pulpwood in Maine, picking oranges in Florida, or repairing railways. The system saved American harvests and gave the prisoners dignity. Yet the camps weren't utopia. Among the POS were hardcore Nazis determined to enforce ideological purity. They formed secret groups, punished traitors, and tried to keep men from going soft. The U.S. Army responded by intelligence, monitoring and separating extremists. The presence of work and responsibility blunted their power. When men spent daylight hours building houses, digging ditches, or working for wages, Nazi lectures lost allure. Some camps even quietly allowed prisoners to vote on internal matters, experiment with democratic procedures, or debate politics, tiny seeds that would later matter when these men returned to rebuild Germany. At Camp Alva in Oklahoma, one of the hardest-line camps, ideological tension turned deadly in isolated incidents. The Army reacted with transfers and stricter supervision. But across most camps, the cooperative, work-centered model held. Once housing and work stabilized daily life, culture flourished. Many camps built libraries stocked with German classics, dictionaries, and technical books. Prisoners taught each other languages, mathematics, engineering. Some took correspondence courses through neutral nations or the YMCA. Music became an outlet and a bridge. At Camp Algona, the POW orchestra played Bach and Beethoven. American guards sometimes listened in quiet fascination. In Texas, choirs performed Christmas concerts audible to local towns, turning suspicion into curiosity. Theater thrived. Men built stages from scrap wood and painted elaborate sets. They performed dramas, comedies, even Shakespeare in translation. At Camp Crossville in Tennessee, locals were invited to see plays, an astonishing trust between former enemies and a rural American audience. Prisoners could write letters under censorship. Red Cross and Swiss observers visited camps, maintaining transparency. News trickled in. Germany's cities bombed, families displaced, war turning. Some men, once convinced of Nazi victory, faced reality behind the barbed wire while enjoying decent treatment. The contrast bit deep. "I came here a believer," said one later. "But I saw fairness, even generosity. It made me question everything Goebbels had told." U.S. American authorities, especially in 1944 and 1945, saw a chance for re-education. They offered German language, newspapers free of Nazi propaganda, lectures on democracy, and films about post-war rebuilding. Many prisoners were receptive, others scoffed, but seeds were planted. Skills mattered too. Men left camps knowing carpentry, farming techniques, English phrases, and democratic habits. Some later used these experiences to rebuild homes and businesses in devastated Germany. Outside work details gave prisoners glimpses of U.S. life. They saw supermarkets, cars, well-dressed women, ordinary prosperity untouched by war's direct destruction. For soldiers from bombed-out Hamburg or rationed Bavaria, the abundance was stunning. A power named Heinrich from Bremen remembered helping on a Kansas farm. "The farmer's wife gave us fresh bread. We had not seen such bread in years. She smiled, though we were her enemies. It confused us deeply." Others were struck by racial dynamics, seeing black American soldiers in uniform with authority, or communities of immigrants thriving. It cracked Nazi propaganda about a decayed, weak America. One of the most enduring memories among former POWs was Christmas. In 1943 and 1944, American camp officers allowed celebrations. Trees decorated, candles, church services, choirs singing Still Nod. Packages arrived via Red Cross with chocolates, cigarettes, warm clothes. Sometimes local churches donated gifts. At Camp Algona, the famous handcrafted nativity scene, life-size figures carved by prisoners, became a local legend. Townspeople visited to see it, and some friendships quietly began across the wire. That simple human contact left a deep mark. Hollywood loves escape stories, but reality was different. The U.S. was too big. There was nowhere practical to go. A few tried cutting wire, hiding on work trucks, even floating barrels down rivers. Most were caught quickly or surrendered from hunger. Many prisoners later said it wasn't worth it. Life inside camp was safe and fair compared to the uncertainty beyond. The deliberate decision to treat POWs well wasn't just moral, it was strategic. U.S. leaders hoped humane treatment would encourage Germans to surrender rather than fight to the death, saving Allied lives. It also projected America's values to potential post-war leaders. It worked. Surrender rates increased late in the war as word filtered back via letters or rumors that captivity in America was survivable, even decent. Some U-boat crews scuttled rather than die. Afrika Korps veterans surrendered en masse once resistance seemed futile. For thousands of these men, camp life was their first exposure to democracy and fair treatment by an enemy. They debated politics openly, read uncensored news, and saw a society that functioned without totalitarian control. After repatriation, some became teachers, engineers, or mayors in West Germany's rebuilding. A few historians trace part of Germany's post-war democratic stability to these quiet lessons in POW camps. When the Third Reich finally collapsed in May 1945, the barbed wire world of the American POW camps began to change. News of Hitler's death, of Germany's surrender, reached even the most remote compounds by shortwave radios, newspapers, and word of mouth. Some prisoners cheered quietly, others sat stunned, unable to process the scale of defeat. Guards reported that many men simply stared at the ground, silent, exhausted. The war they had been told would end in victory had ended with unconditional surrender. For the Americans, victory created a new question: what to do with nearly 500,000 enemy soldiers now living on U.S. soil. They could not remain forever. The Geneva Convention required eventual repatriation, yet shipping them home would take time. Europe's ports were in ruins, and Allied ships still ferried troops and supplies. During this limbo, camp life continued, but softened. Security remained, but restrictions eased. Guards and prisoners, long used to one another, often had cordial relationships, Some G's brought small gifts or showed family photos. Prisoners, many of them skilled craftsmen, built thank you gifts out of scrap wood, picture frames, toys, even furniture, and offered them to guards who had treated them decently. Work continued as well. America still faced shortages, and POW labor remained vital. Farmers asked to keep their crews through harvest. Timber crews cut for reconstruction needs. Some communities quietly lobbied to delay repatriation because the extra hands were so useful. For prisoners, the thought of going home was bittersweet. They longed for family, but feared what awaited. Bombed cities, poverty, uncertainty. Some worried about Soviet occupation in the East. Others dreaded being branded defeatists or traitors. A few had built a strange, safe routine in captivity and weren't eager to trade it for chaos. Departure came in waves. Men were assembled, counted, and loaded onto trains bound for coastal ports. Many traveled to Camp Shanks in New York or Newport News in Virginia before boarding. Liberty ships for the long return across the Atlantic. Some were rerouted first to Britain or France for labor before final release. The Allies used POW manpower to clear rubble and rebuild railways. Saying goodbye to the camps was emotional. In Texas and the Midwest, local farmers sometimes gathered to wave farewell. Children who had watched the enemy work their parents' fields cried as trucks rolled away. A few guards shook hands discreetly. They were soldiers like us, one American sergeant said later. They just wore the other uniform. For the Germans, the memories were complicated. They had been captives, yet often treated with fairness unimaginable in the propaganda they'd once believed. They had been trusted with tools, food, and even glimpses of normal life. Many went home carrying small American mementos, handmade gifts, photos with guards, English books. Life back in Germany was stark. Cities lay in rubble. Food was scarce. Yet former POS found themselves surprisingly resilient. They knew how to build quickly. After all, they had built their own barracks. They knew democratic habits, even if faint. Committees, voting on work details, fair argument. Many had learned trades or improved language skills. These practical lessons served them in Reconstruction. Some also carried a profound mental shift. One ex-prisoner wrote in his memoir, "I came to America an enemy. I left with doubt about everything I had been taught to hate." Another said simply, "In the camp I first met freedom. Strange to find it as a prisoner." Decades later, historians would note that these quiet experiences helped West Germany's post-war transformation. The Marshall Plan, democracy, rebuilding. They met a generation of men who had glimpsed fairness in captivity and were less susceptible to extremism afterward. There were also personal bonds. Former POWs returned to visit the small American towns near their camps. Letters crossed the Atlantic prisoners, writing thanks to the farmers who fed them, the guards who treated them kindly. Some lifelong friendships formed. A few even emigrated back to the U.S. after the war to start new lives. The story of being handed tools to build their own housing remained one of the most striking memories. It symbolized something larger, an unexpected trust from enemies, a practical but deeply human gesture. Many who had arrived expecting hatred instead found an invitation to take responsibility and restore dignity. They built more than barracks. They built a bridge, however small, between two worlds. America's approach was not flawless. There were incidents of abuse, of Nazi intimidation, of hardship and loneliness. Not every guard was kind, but compared to the brutality on the Eastern Front or even the harsher British camps, the American system stood out. It was an experiment in practicality and morality combined, and it largely succeeded. For the Americans, it was also strategy. Humane treatment encouraged surrender and saved lives. It modeled the society the U.S. claimed to defend, and it delivered labor when the country needed hands. But beyond strategy, it revealed something about national character, even in total war. A pragmatic decency persisted. When former German soldiers look back, many remember one moment, stepping off the train, expecting cages, and instead being given planks and nails. They were enemies, but also builders, humans still trusted to create shelter. That memory cut deep and lingered long after. Today, a few of the camps are preserved as quiet museums. In Algona, Iowa, the famous nativity scene carved by POS still stands each Christmas, visited by locals and travelers. In Texas, historical markers tell of German soldiers who built their own huts and later wrote back with gratitude. These places remind us that war does not have to erase humanity. The legacy is powerful. When victory allowed cruelty, the United States chose order and fairness instead. It turned thousands of captives into workers, learners, and, eventually, peaceful citizens again. That decision saved trouble during the war and may have planted seeds for peace. Afterward, the story also warns and teaches. Treatment of prisoners can echo for generations. Brutality breeds bitterness. Decency can disarm hate by trusting enemies just enough to let them build. The U.S. quietly undermined Nazi myths and gave young men a first look at another way of living. Imagine being a 20-year-old soldier who had crossed deserts or seas to fight a terrifying enemy, captured, defeated, expecting pain, and instead someone hands you a hammer. Build your house, they say. It's hard to keep believing old lies when you're trusted to shape your own shelter. That small act of faith was practical. Yes, but also profound. It turned barbed wire camps into strange classrooms where democracy, dignity, and craftsmanship replaced despair. It is one of World War II's quiet revolutions, happening not on battlefields, but in lumber yards behind the wire. The war was the deadliest in history. Yet even there, light pierced through. In Texas, heat and Iowa winters. In Alabama, pine woods. In Kansas, wheat fields. Prisoners built roofs over their heads and perhaps over their hearts. They went home changed. And so, decades later, when former German POWs told their children about the war, some spoke not just of loss, but of unexpected respect. They remembered fair treatment, decent food, and that moment of surprise when the guards gave them tools. We were enemies, one man told an interviewer, but they let us be men again. That is the quiet power of a simple act, a hammer passed across a divide. It didn't stop the war, but it helped stop hate from living forever in those who fought it. And for the United States, it proved that strength and humanity are not opposites. Sometimes they build the same house.